Hello students, welcome to part E of this mini e-lecture series on variable weather and changing climate. What is happening to the Earth's climate? Now, today we are going to move on to how does climate change affects people, and to answer this we are going to have the following e-lecture objectives. Number 1, describe the impacts of climate change, and number 2, explain how these impacts have affected people. Before we begin, I want you to think about this question. How does climate change affect people? How do you think climate change has affected you and the people around you and the people who live in further away areas, in rural areas near the sea and on the mountains? Do you think it's affected everyone equally? Just think about it for a moment. Put yourself in the shoes of someone who lives in another area. Fortunately for you, or unfortunately, you have lived in an era where the climate has already changed a bit or a lot. So you might not see the change, but how do you think the climate has changed for your grandparents over the past 50 years? Think about this and take some notes first. Okay, we're going to move on. Now, to study how climate change affects people, let's first look at the 4 key impacts of climate change. So as we move on, we're going to describe the changes and explain how it has affected people. So we'll talk about the impacts of these 4 on people. Okay, let's start with the first one by looking at this cartoon. What do you think has happened here? Why are the sharks so happy? Well, if you look at this, what is the impact? He has it on his cartoon, right? If you go back to social studies, you can say that the cartoonist is trying to highlight the seriousness of sea level rise to people through humor. He's talking about how serious it is such that the sharks will be able to get to the man in 5 years. How much would the sea level rise for the sharks to be able to swim to him in 5 years? How serious do you think this is? Okay, now sea level rise essentially is the increase in the mean heights of the sea surface between the high and the low tide relative to land. As you would know, there is high tide and there is low tide, and in between this high and low tide, we call it the sea level. It is also the beginning of the 0 meter point from which we measure our altitude. What happens is that as the temperatures increase, water will expand. As the water temperatures increase as well, it also causes ice to melt. And the ice in the North and the South Pole and the areas in the Arctic and the Antarctic Circle are populated by ice fields and ice seas called glaciers, and these will melt. And when they melt, they add water to the sea. And what happens when your ice melts? Your water increases and your sea level rises. And this is actually very serious. And if you look at this, look at the 2 diagrams. If they're happening in the same time period, what is the relationship between sea level and sea ice? Take a minute, write this down in your book, and pause the video for just a while. Okay, I hope you have paused the video and done it. If you haven't, do it now. I'm going to explain very quickly. Now, as you can see, as the sea levels rise, well, this is predicted of course, but as the sea levels rise, within this period, 1900 to 2000, what happens is that the sea ice is decreasing. So, with more coastal lands at risk of the continued sea level increase, how will people be affected? What will happen to the homes of people who live near the sea? It will cause people who live near the sea to lose their homes, and it also will cause people who are dependent on livelihoods that are dependent on the sea, for example fishermen, to have their livelihoods affected. The next impact of climate change is frequent extreme weather events. Extreme weather events are essentially severe and rare weather phenomenon that results in significant economic loss, and the loss of lives. Some examples you may know would be Typhoon Haiyan and Hurricane Sandy, and other things like heat waves, floods, droughts, and tropical cyclones. So these are some frequent extreme weather events, and if you look at this table, it is a record of the number of extreme weather events that have been happening in the past 100 years. You will realize that in the past 50 over years, it has increased tremendously. If you look at this table, this tells you the losses in terms of billion dollars. So every time they lose a few billion dollars, okay, what happens? So they'll tabulate this, and you look at this. In the past 20 years, the trend is increasing. The number of events per year is getting higher. How do you think this will impact people? As buildings, as cities are damaged, people lose their lives, people lose their livelihoods, people lose infrastructure, and all these cost more money. And when governments have to pump money into rebuilding infrastructure, into bringing emergency supplies, we lose the amount of money being diverted into education, into improvement of infrastructure. And this will have a great impact on people. The third impact of climate change is the spread of infectious insect-borne diseases. While humans and sometimes plants don't really like the increased temperatures, of course none of us like the increased temperatures, some other living things love this increase in temperature. Now, insects need warmth to grow and to proliferate, and they are cold-blooded, so the warmer it is, the easier it is for them to grow. If you live in a country where there are 4 seasons, you'll realize that during winter you don't really see many insects, but in summer they come out and play. And there has been a link that has been drawn between insect-borne diseases and climate change. As climate changes and as the globe warms up, this causes increased rainfall and temperatures, and this is very favorable for mosquitoes to breed. And this allows the spread of malaria and dengue fever. So if you would know, the past 2 years, dengue fever has increased significantly in Singapore with over 700 cases a week, or was it a month? Now this seriousness is not just happening in tropical countries like us. I want you to go and find out more about details, by the way, okay? Now, as temperate countries also get warmer, mosquitoes are able to breed further and further up north of the equator. Suddenly, the latitudes do not have such a great impact anymore. And as their breeding areas increase, they will increase. And as that happens, malaria won't just affect the tropical belt, but it will also affect places further north and south of the equator. And more people who are not ready for these diseases will become ill because of the growth and the proliferation of these mosquitoes. The last impact of climate change is the lengthening of growing season in certain regions. Now, these high temperatures have actually led to longer growing seasons. As you know, plants need more to grow, and this, in a way, has become an advantage as the core regions are now warmer and allows for more crops to grow. In UK, which you know is pretty cold and very grey, the number of types of crops that can be grown has increased. In Canada, which is also pretty far up north, remember it's here, okay, the number of fruits, soybeans, potatoes, and wheat has increased. However, this is also a disadvantage as some plants and some fruits actually need the cold to grow better. So what happens is that in China, Yunnan, apple and cherries production has reduced as they need the cool conditions, and the wheat yield in general in Canada has decreased. So if you know, Cameron Highlands is very famous for strawberries, and strawberries grow in Cameron Highlands because it is cold. So what happens when the temperatures increase in general? The farmers who are dependent on growing these fruit crops will have their livelihood affected if their area gets warmer, and the type of fruits that we can eat in general may also eventually reduce because of the general warming of the earth. So to recap, the 4 key impacts of climate change are sea level rise, increase in frequent extreme weather events, the spread of infectious insect-borne diseases, and the lengthening of growing seasons in certain regions, and these have great impacts on the livelihoods and of the living patterns of different people. Okay, so this brings us to the end of how does climate change affect people. Stay tuned for the next e-lecture. Goodbye!